Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mandy Vaughn. Pleasure to meet everybody and join everyone again for another SpaceTime. So welcome to another episode. This is the National Security Space Association SpaceTime interview series. Thank you for spending a little bit of your valuable time with us today. My name is Mandy Vaughn, and I've got the privilege of serving as the chair of NSSA's workforce development efforts. So these discussions that we conduct as SpaceTime are part of our contribution to the national security space community under our scope of the Mormon Center for Space Studies. We at the NSSA are proud to continue to uphold the name and legacy of our dear friend, General Mormon. So today, I'm honored to be guiding a discussion with Dr. Claire Leon. She is the first leader of the Space Systems Integration Office for Space Systems Command. She leads the SSIO team in uniting the system of systems integration efforts across all of SSC's PEOs, their portfolios, and with the mission partners across the national security space enterprise. Prior to joining the Space Force, she was leading the Graduate Systems Engineering program at Loyola Marymount University, just up the road from SSC. She previously worked for the U.S. Air Force as a member of the Senior Executive Service as the Director of the Launch Enterprise Directorate. She started her career at Hughes in the Space and Communications Group, in the Propulsion Department, moved through system tests, systems engineering, line management, program management, and retired from Boeing as the Vice President of National Programs. So this morning, Dr. Leon will make some opening remarks, and then we will open up for Q&A. I have some questions prepared to kind of help kick the discussion along. But if members of our audience would like to ask and pose a question, please do so by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will try to get through as many of your questions as I can. We have until the top of the hour to do so. So we look forward to a discussion about the SSIO, its role, what makes it different, and how this is beneficial to the Space Force and SSC, and how it links across the entirety of the national space security community. So Dr. Leon, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and allowing me some time to share what's going on at SSC and within SSIO. As Mandy said, it's kind of an inaugural office, or I'm the first director, so it's definitely an interesting time. The previous department was the portfolio architect, and some people were familiar with that. With the stand-up of SSC, the shift was to focus more on integration, and so I think a lot is changing with respect to government programs and space architecture. The legacy of SMC was some exquisite programs, what we would call high value assets. So you had WGS and Advanced EHF and SBIRS. And we're trying to shift, and with the threat in space, and I do think the threat is one of the big changes that's driving a shift in architecture. So we're trying to shift away from these programs of record that are, high value assets, somewhat proliferated around the globe, where if you lose one asset, you lose significant mission capability. Even beyond the cost, the concern is losing that mission capability. And, we know that between China and Russia, the threat is real. And so where we used to consider space as the high ground and unthreatened, we no longer have that luxury. So for pretty much for every constellation, we're trying to shift to be much more resilient and robust. So in the OPIR area, the high value assets program of record, or the SBIRS program, and the shift is to proliferated low Earth orbit and proliferated medium Earth orbit, a combination. So that's a pretty big shift, and it's still, maybe somewhat ahead of us to prove that technology, but with a large proliferated LEO constellation, if you lose one or two or three satellites, you're not losing 25% of your capability or blinding capability over a specific area. But with this shift in architecture comes a need to integrate at a different level. So with the programs that were the high value assets, you could have all the data coming down, you'd have it controlled by one group, and very centralized capability and control. with the proliferated LEO MEO, Space Development Agency is actually doing the proliferated LEO, and SSC is doing the MEO capability. So now we have a need to manage interfaces. Where is data coming in? What's the data format? What's the protocols? What's the processing? What's the timelines? And so with this change, we need to integrate at a higher level. So one of the shifts, the Portfolio Architect's Office was doing more work at the trying to enable speed and agility with combat bus or hosted payloads. And so the team had been trying to manage interfaces somewhat internal to spacecraft, and I'm trying to shift that to managing interfaces across systems. So, again, you could take missile warning, missile track as an example. Where is the data from SDA coming in? What's the format? Where is it stored? How is it processed? And then we want that same processing, the same data coming from MEO to be melded and joined so that you could then process that entire set. So that, again, that gets into the need for managing interfaces. We're also transitioning to having more optical capability, and so there's discussion of low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, GEO. You'd like to have a connected network in space. To do that, you need interfaces between those layers. So again, these are big interfaces, but even at the data level, how is data coming in? What are the protocols for data? Where is it stored? So again, the need for an architecture and interface standards and the vision of how data comes in, how it's merged, who uses it. So anyway, there's just a need for managing, integration across, and we want to be working with missile defense and, the NRO and the other partner organizations. So we're not going to control what the NRO does by any stretch of the imagination, but if we're going to leverage their capability, again, we need to understand interfaces and where can we work together to get after the threat and to be prepared for a fight if it ever gets to that level. So I think there is a fundamental shift, and some of it's that integration role, but it's in response to the threat and a need to change how we do business. In addition to government integration, there's also a desire to bring in more commercial. And I think this is also a fundamental shift, and to bring in international. And so if you think about resilient systems architectures, being able to leverage government capability and commercial capability and international, that is inherently more resilient than all government-owned systems. And the government probably couldn't afford to develop all of the capability, but we can leverage what commercial's already doing and kind of pay as you go for what capability you need. So I do think there's a shift. I know there's concern that in the past the government has talked that they want to leverage commercial and hasn't necessarily acted. I think that is changing, and the demand signals there. We also have to get after requirements, for example. So, the program executive officers, the PEOs that run the different mission areas, they're somewhat constrained by the budget process. And so they can't spend money that's not authorized by Congress. And so over time, we'd like to shift from having program of record requirements to mission area requirements that gives them more flexibility. But that'll take working with Congress and developing trust and still providing visibility, but hopefully providing more flexibility as well.
Wow, lots to unpack there. So I think I think you just kind of help provide a little bit of context in terms of the breadth of the job, as well as kind of the clean sheet of paper in terms of how much change we can expect to see coming from it and throughout SSC, which is pretty exciting. So you touched on it just a bit, but kind of the difference between the portfolio architect and the SSIO. What are some of your unique or new authorities or new scope, and what is the expectation on what this means for SSC for future acquisition?
I'm not sure what new authorities there are. If you looked at an SSC org chart, you'd see that there are multiple mission areas, and those mission areas from an organize, train, and equip standpoint go up to General Gutlein. But from an acquisition standpoint, they go up to Mr. Calvelli, the service acquisition executive. So the PEOs are all dual-hatted. General Gutlein, in addition to having the organize, train, and equip responsibilities for all of SSC, he also has a space systems integrator role that goes up to Mr. Calvelli. So if Mr. Calvelli is doing an acquisition panel or approving an act strategy for a PEO, the expectation is General Gutlein's sitting right next to him, or me representing General Gutlein, or one of the other top four, so that we have an SSC voice to say this acquisition strategy makes sense, it is well thought out, and it integrates with the overall system. And so my office is really the office that is doing the background work to enable that function. So, specifically what authorities I have is probably it's an interesting question. I'm not an acquisition organization. I am a support organization to, again, General Gutlein, Mr. Calvelli. My office has three main functions. One is on the engineering side. The engineering side has an intel shop. So again, we're trying to be very threat informed, and we actually are receiving additional intel resources so that we can essentially put intel capability into each of the PEO's offices, so that each PEO then has some capability to understand the specific threat to their systems and make sure that their systems can address the threat. So intel is an important piece, and then engineering, modeling and simulation, modeling the threat, modeling the U.S. government capabilities. How does the threat interface, how does the threat impact the design, and what should PEOs be doing differently in the future? So a modeling and simulation capability, as well as kind of the engineering standards. So we have the group that defines, so if, I'm sure people are familiar with, an RFP goes out and you have to be compliant with all these MIL standards. We're actually trying to shift from, SSC specific standards to industry standards. So trying to leverage what IEEE is doing, what AIAA is doing. And so trying to not have so many government written documents, if that makes sense. So there's the engineering standards, then there's the interfaces. And so some of the interfaces that we're trying to manage are things like, the inter-satellite system links. So you could imagine optical to optical, that would be a type of standard, but also digital engineering. So when working with contractors, what digital engineering capabilities should be on the contractor side, what models should be delivered from the contractor, what makes sense, and trying to get that level of fidelity and detail right. What I absolutely do not want to see is that the government asks for all these digital models, and then they get delivered. So the contractor spends money on them, and then they get delivered, and then we do nothing with them. So we don't want that, but we do think there's enabling capability from the contractors. They're modeling anyway. So, an example would be a spacecraft simulator. That should be a model that gets delivered and ingested. Today, we actually hire a contractor from a training standpoint to essentially reverse engineer how the contractor's satellite works. And that seems like a waste. Why not have the contractor deliver a model and just be able to ingest it? But as soon as you say that, you need standards. So how does it interface? Where does it, is it a hardware simulator? Is it a software simulator? If it's a software simulator, how does it integrate into the ground? So thinking out all of those kinds of things. So anyway, that's our engineering group. So both the traditional, standards that, hopefully keep you safe when you buy a satellite, that you have part standards and thermal standards and all that. But then also the inter-system standards, and then modeling and simulation, digital engineering, and all that. So that's like a third of the organization. And then I have a requirements and capability integration group. So there's something we call the U-turn chart that starts with this Space Warfighting Analysis Center, so SWAC. They do force designs, and so they're trying to be very analytically driven, but develop models of how the world works, essentially how the systems would work, and then model the capability that we need in the future. So their force design is a set of capabilities. It is not a point design. It's not an implementation recommendation. So once we get a force design to say you need these capabilities, then my organization working with the Pentagon would be creating a set of program requirements, also partnering with the program executive officers, because what we don't want to do is work off to the side and hand something to the PEOs. We need to partner, and we need to make sure that we're in agreement that that this is the right set of requirements to go procure. So again, I have a requirements group that supports that process. We have a futures group that's looking at future technology. So where is innovation happening? And there is a lot of innovation happening in the government and particularly in commercial. And then how do you weave in innovation into those future architectures? So we have a group that's focused on that. And then we have a capability integration area that's looking at kind of the mission and how to execute it. So again, when you had just programs of record, you had a ConOps and you just implemented your ConOps and life was good. But in a contested environment, what capabilities do you need? What are your indications and warning? What systems do you need to leverage? Where does data flow? What's the timeline? But thinking through multiple vignettes so that if we do end up, in a contested environment, that we're really ready to go. And so that's a significant area as well.
Wow. What can you share in terms of some of your near-term priorities? Because that's certainly a lot to unpack and kind of roll out. What are some of your near-term priorities, maybe between what you're doing across SSC from that process perspective, as well as mission areas that you guys are really looking at first for that integration activity?
Well, so there's lots of priorities, but there's also many teams that are working different areas as well. But from, I could say off the top of my head, we're currently working on 4 different workshops. And so that's kind of an indicator that these are important areas. We just held a 2-day workshop on enterprise ground. And so there's been a mandate to transition to an enterprise ground system and get away from every program kind of doing their own thing with respect to ground, and then having that ground capability go to the ops area and have every ground system look a little different. So we just ran a 2-day workshop on that. The enterprise ground progress has not been as great as we have wanted it to be, and so we were trying to figure out what the vision is and what every program's doing, and how to bring all that together. And so one of the discoveries with that was actually that one of the barriers is having a governance process for integrating onto a hardware platform, and what mission unique software should be developed by contractors and how it should be integrated. So the demand signal coming out of the workshop is that we need to work harder on governance and interfaces to enable programs to be more successful. So anyway, enterprise ground and the specific go forward plan is a major priority, and partly to make the enterprise ground system successful, but then also have a program by program plan. So that's a priority. Digital engineering so my organization has the charter to implement digital engineering and digital transformation for all of the U.S. Space Force. And so, and we are in our formative stages for that. We have lots of digital engineering activities going on throughout SSC, but they're kind of driven by at the PEO level, and then my organization is doing things like setting standards for style guides and MBSE, and again digital models and what the should be. But we don't have yet an integrated plan for how all of this comes together. So we're designing that. So one of our next workshops will be the digital engineering workshop, and trying to leverage what's going on in all of the PEO areas, look at lessons learned, and then come up with an integrated plan going forward. But then also reaching out to STARCOM and SPOC and make sure that we've got, again, an integrated plan. So that's another area. The 2 other areas where we have workshops coming up, one is in data. And so, again, thinking about all of the various systems that we're procuring and the data that's coming down from satellites and how it's processed, you can say it's very likely that there's data that gets left unlooked at. And so, so where are the pain points, and what is a better plan going forward? And that could very well end up being coupled with digital engineering and that digital environment. So trying to figure that out. And again, as we're moving into more sophisticated architectures and higher volume of data, that becomes even a bigger imperative. And then the last, I mean, it's not going to be the last workshop we're going to do, but the one that's currently, out there that we want to tackle is network. And so, networking between systems. How do we move data today? We have a lot of stovepipe systems. We obviously want to break that down. We also have to deal with multi-security level data, everything unclass, secret, top secret, SAP, whatnot. So how does all this connect, and what is our, kind of networking strategy over, to implement. So again, we think there's gaps. We have programs that are underway right now. So for example, there's a program called Mesh 1T, create a mesh network, but it doesn't go to that last mile in every place. And so again, where are the gaps? So those are some of the near-term priorities.
Wow. Okay. So big part of the SSIO is the I for integration. So what is the role and what is the overlap between SSIO and the support to the Program Integration Council, or the PIC? And how has the PIC operated in practice? And can you share examples of any kind of decisions that have come out of that?
Okay, so the Program Integration Council includes SSC, SDA, Space RCO, DAF RCO, STARCOM, SPAC. We bring in NASA when needed, for example. And so it is a coordinating body. It is not a decision body. My organization also has a function called the PIC Secretariat that in theory, they don't work for me. They work for the PIC, right? So their charter is from the PIC, but again, from an organized, train, and equip, and from setting priorities. So my group, works with the action officers from all of those, those other government organizations, and takes on specific issues, works, the issues up to a certain level to the point where they need a vector, that's coming from the PIC, and then we do a presentation to the PIC. Most, if not all, of the conversations tend to be classified, so I probably can't really get into specifics. It is a place where we also coordinate the POM, so the annual budget process. And there was this very strong push this year from General Gutlein to make sure that there are no seams between the mission partners. So, one of the best ways to lose your budget is if, the staffers ask, the NRO this question, they ask us that question, and they don't match. It's a good way to highlight a potential gap. And so worked really hard to identify, particularly jointly funded programs, or things like crypto, where funding has been across organizations, or had been funded by the Air Force, and so now we're shifting to Space Force. So how are we doing things in the future? So crypto might be a good area where you could talk about a specific, is that a lot of crypto was funded by individual programs, but there was this pool that was funded by the Air Force, and so then that budget needed to get moved to SSC, but it didn't come over to, and didn't satisfy all the needs. So what's the new budget process going to be? So that, that was something that came up before a PIC. Another, kind of a little bit generic example is we have a joint system with the NRO, and so what's the follow-on? And so should we go ahead and again, jointly POM for the next generation? And in that specific case, we were asked to go back and look at commercial capability and allied capability before we commit to the next generation. So I think that's an existence proof that we're serious about trying to leverage commercial, is not going forward with an acquisition plan to go buy the next 2 or 3 or 4 satellites and wait and make sure that we did those studies.
And earlier you mentioned the U-turn chart of the force design activities and how the SWAC kind of kicks that off a bit. So I think the SWAC's work, especially in the missile warning areas, seems to be very well received across the community, but they can only work on so many force design efforts and analyses at a time, right? So how does the SSIO, how do you balance the longer term look of that force design process coming out of the SWAC with the pressures of addressing existing program of record pace or issues? How do you balance that?
So SWAC so you're exactly right. SWAC cannot do all force designs all at once. And
we'd like them to, but we get it.
They have a schedule, and they've said, the missile warning missile trap was first. They recently had they flowed out the space data transport. And so I would equate space data transport to, you know, previous MILSATCOM, and so trying to think a little bit more broadly with, you know, communications and data movement and all of that. So we are just receiving that, you know, space data transport force design, and so so we have a team that's then dissecting that and then figuring out how that shapes COM for the future. SWAC has said that, you know, PNT will be next year, so 23, so we'll be ready for that. What my team's doing in the meantime is looking at each mission area, and so we've created what we call war rooms, which are trying to take warfighter requirements and current program of record and how long the current programs are going to be, you know, what's the prediction, you know, they call it the functional availability analysis, how long will these systems last, and so what is it imperative to put the next system, you know, to do the strategy for the next system. So we're trying to be prepared mission area by mission area, and there's about 10 mission areas, so that when we can either try to be prepped so that when SWAC does come out with something, that we've done that groundwork and we're ready to receive. So we're trying to do that across all areas, and I can tell you they are of very, if I, you know, the fidelity of the war rooms, or the mission stories, you could call them as well, they vary, you know, from mission area, you know, so so we are still in the storming, you know, the whole the change management thing, storming, forming, norming, and performing. We are in the storming, and so this, in particularly, I would say our relationship with SWAC is also storming, and so this space data transport is really the first time. You could say missile warning, they did a force design for previously, except that SDA kind of, I think, got out ahead of it. They were doing the proliferated LEO, and then the force design kind of adopted that and then added MEO and did a ton of analysis to validate. So I would not call that one our first time. I would say space data transport's our first time, and we're really in the process for that. So in terms of priorities, it's trying to have a plan or understand the story for each mission area and be ready to receive when SWAC is ready to provide a force design.
Okay. So how, a follow-on question to this, so how does the SSIO plan, or are you able to take advantage of possible pop-ups or unplanned targets of opportunity, technology readiness, or commercial integration demos, what have you? How can you effectively roll in something that's maybe not part of that baseline plan into this mission area architecture?
Right. So one of the challenges, I think, is just how much innovation is out there. So a pop-up might happen in a particular mission area, but I think what's more likely is being able to leverage the innovation organizations. So, and primarily that's, you know, AFRL, for example. So AFRL is our partner with respect to developing future capabilities. So there's a lead who's Dr. Andy Williams, is the space lead for AFRL, and he's partners definitely with my organization, but he's also considered General Gutlein's chief engineer. So we're trying to make sure that we're integrated. We also have under General Shaba's group, he has a prototyping and innovation division under Joe Roth, who's in Albuquerque. So we'd leverage the prototyping done there, and then within that group as well is SpaceWorks, and SpaceWorks is, you know, continually putting out calls for to be able to innovate, you know, from a small business standpoint, being able to fund specific capabilities. I think where my organization comes in is trying to pay attention to all of these organizations, and there's a lot more than just those three, you know, from DIU to you know, even the commercial companies. We're trying to pay attention to that, and then again back to the war rooms, being able to map in that innovation, and when does that need to be developed to be able to impact the next program. So we're trying to create that site picture.
And how do you then close the loop? Is it within the war room between what is that kind of a market space, that innovation ecosystem, and how does that loop back into the PEOs as they define their program?
So I think that, again, that's by partnering with the PEOs, so trying to have some joint reviews. Again, we're trying to create the visibility. Depending on the specific PEO area, they may be kind of way out ahead of us, and some we may be kind of pushing, and so it really varies, you know, PEO by PEO.
And let's see, starting to see some questions coming in from the audience here. So this one's a go back as it pertains to the enterprise ground system. Are there any core tenets or technologies that are part of the mandate to improve, whether that be the digital twin, cloud-based, frequency of deployments, et cetera?
So from an implementation standpoint, I don't think there are, well, okay, so where mandates come from? There's not mandates coming from higher. The mandate from coming up higher is really to address the concerns of SPOC and operations, and to do a better job at not having, 50 different ground systems that look different to operators, and try to bring down that training load. So the mandate is really an improvement mandate to make the operations environment more effective. So, if the hardware, if the tech stack is the same across programs, it'll be easier to maintain. So that to some level, you could say, is that a mandate? Definitely a recommendation, but we also can't transition everything all at once. So then there's a timeline. And so what programs are more important to address near term, and what ones are more important to address long term. And then there's a set of services. So there's enterprise ground services like antenna as a service, or flight dynamics, and trying to address those. And then what services are best leveraged across many programs. So then again, which ones do you want to do first? Because you can't do everything all at once. So again, I think what we're trying to do is address SPOC's needs from both the maintenance standpoint, the operator standpoint, and then trying not to be as tied to a specific contractor, so that there's more flexibility. And then you have to also address mission unique. And so how can you better integrate mission unique so that it's not so expensive to, because it's always going to be mission unique depending on the program. So are there ways to use some of like the agile software processes to better integrate some of that mission unique?
So another follow-on question to kind of the SSIO's relationship with PEOs and program of record. So somebody's asked, is there any thought to giving SSIO direct funding or control over parts of a program of record to ensure that integration actually happens, rather than happening just through coordination? Or will the SSIO have veto authority over program of record CCBs?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. One of the other pieces of the organization that gives a little bit of control, if you want to call it control, is the POM process. So my organization rolls up the budget requirements from each of the programs, and the 5-year funding and whatnot. So we have so again, I think that creates a lot of visibility. So, and then there's an implied, if we don't, if we disagree with their plan, then we could go into a coordination of their budget, right? But that's not really the intent. I think what I really want to do is partner with the PEOs and not try to mandate. So we are, again, in the storming is the governance process for engineering. And so, clearly with the enterprise standards, enterprise ground interfaces, that needs to be at a CCB level that's above a PEO. So, it's going across PEOs. With respect to internal to PEOs, there's programs, we want them to run their own CCBs. But we are in the process of working out the governance processes. They are not completely baked. I do not expect to get budget from PEOs to be able to do what I want on their programs. Again, we're not an acquisition organization. But I think the real goal is to create, is this an organization that has the bandwidth to be able to look across all of the programs and identify those kinds of issues, and then figure out what the resolution is. Like, an example of when we held the EGS workshop, the enterprise ground workshop, we could, the programs were very supportive, and they came and really explained what they are doing and what they're not doing. And so I think what my organization can help with is priorities. So there's a weather system follow-on program that's being flown out of Blossom Point that's really standalone. It's not EGS. Is it important for it to be EGS? It's not taxing SPOC. And so at this point in time, I would put that at a low priority. And so do we need to transition it to enterprise ground? Maybe, maybe not, but I would make it the lowest priority. So I think one of the ways to deal with the PEOs is to try to do that independent assessment and pick the priorities, because you can't do everything at once.
Right. So good integration question here. So how does the Commercial Services Office integrate into a lot of these things? SWAC, the PIC, your office, how do they plug into this?
So I will put this also in the storming category. So there's a couple different commercial services groups. One is Claire Grayson's group that's been doing, contracting for SATCOM services for DoD for a long time, and it's been very successful. That's really handled outside the program of record, right? So, you have WGS and Advanced HF and Discus and MilStar and all that is what's MilSatcom, and then her office has been operating separately. So the goal is to integrate and to be much more aware of, at a total support to U.S. Space Force, where are the space data transport, how are those requirements being satisfied? So what is being done by program of records? What's being done by is planned for future systems like, ESS is the Evolved Strategic SATCOM, so that'll eventually replace Advanced HF. And then where does commercial, what niche can it fill? It is not going to fill strategic, but it can cover backhaul. And so, you'll find that the SWAC force design for space data transport helps bring in commercial. And what we haven't necessarily figured out yet is Allied, but we have Deanna Ryle's group that's very aggressively working with international. And so we've actually had, Deanna's led some summits where you bring in international partners. We've actually brought them into our space data transport or MilSatcom war room, and then talked through what part could an international partner take. And so, examples might be, a ground terminal in country where we have trouble getting, it's work for us, but they could contribute, to the overall capability by providing ground or by, joining in on the next procurement of a WGS or something like that. Some of this has been done before, but we're trying to figure out how to enhance that. But I do think it's a mix of SWAC opening up the force design to allow, to include not just typical government programs, but the use of commercial. So, what space is commercial best positioned to provide capability. But I think, again, over time, we need to relook at the requirements process, because the typical way programs are funded is through programs of record. And the PEOs cannot fund things that are not funded through Congress, right? So if we open up and shift from, having individual programs go through the JROC process to mission area capabilities go through the JROC process, and have the PEOs have the flexibility to, buy an ESS or leverage SpaceX or, OneWeb or other systems, but we have to have the PEOs have the authority. Otherwise, it kind of has to be done by a side group like Claire Grayson's group.
Right. So how is that transition happening, and how does that link in with even the JROC process as well, to be talking about mission areas rather than programs of record? Just kind of curious in terms of status, or how real is that for your implementation?
So I think that is aspirational at this point.
Okay.
So I think the conversations are starting. I think General LaCour is aware. He's also retiring, so I think General Grant's coming in after him.
Yep.
But we will start to have those conversations. But I think we are at the vision state right now, and we have to then work with the powers that be, including Congress, to say, hey, what would the benefit be if we shifted this, right?
Good. Okay. Let's see, one question in terms of people, right? So SSC is undergoing a lot of change, turning into a command, re-architecting a lot of the portfolio. Where do you have the most needs? where is kind of the SSC's talent base, and how are you trying to work your talent base that you have access to kind of meet this new architecting integration idea?
Yeah, so as you mentioned at the beginning, I spent most of my career in industry. And then after 34 years there, I retired and I worked in launch first. And I think one of the eye-opening things transitioning from industry to government is how you manage your workforce. And so in industry, it's you probably have two levers. Really, it's the direct employees that work for the company, and then you bring in subcontractors to for sprint kind of help. And you have that constant decision of, do I want full-time people that I then have to provide benefits for, or what's that contractor mix, and does the contractors have the same level of commitment and whatnot? So in the government, the difference is, so your organic resources are military and civilian, and those are managed a little bit differently. And then we have a very strong technical support from the FFRDCs, and so primarily aerospace, but also MITRE, APL. So there's some others, but the predominance is aerospace. And then in addition to that, because that does not necessarily cover all of the technical and support needs, we have then contractor support. And so, and those are, contracts, so seated contractors or financial services and support or office support. So the way you manage is really very different. It was kind of eye-opening to me, particularly in launch. So now that I'm coming back for a second time, I'm a little more familiar with this. So I'm still, for my organization, I'm still in the assessment phase of, where are we strong? Where do we need to augment? And, do I need more bodies or do I need different skills? I think the place where I would say we need stronger skills is in this, is in the analysis and the identifying, requirements for future systems so that we can be strong partners to the PEOs. They say a lot of the technical capabilities in the PEO area, we're trying to be almost more the futures. And so PEOs have the program of record and the execution, and some not as much bandwidth. Again, it depends by PEO and what their priorities are. Not as much bandwidth to shape the future and understand what AFRL is doing. So we're trying to bring that visibility. But I think from a protect and defend standpoint, from the contested space, trying to understand all of those mission threads, I think that's probably an area where we are making some progress, but not as fast as we need to. So I would say it's those end-to-end mission threads and how do you operate, and then what tools do you need to really bring visibility at an ops level so that you've got really good situational awareness. So I think we are just getting after even identifying that there's a gap, and so how do you bring more visibility to the folks that are in the ops centers so that they can tell the status of every system, et cetera, et cetera. So those mission threads and really thinking through being agile and nimble if you did get into a contested time.
So SSC organizational question from the audience. So previous instantiation of SSC's organization showed capability integration that interfaced directly with the mission areas. Your new organization shows a capability organization that's somewhat a little different than that. Given this change, what are some of those touch points with SSIO?
Okay, so the Portfolio Architect Office was designed when SMC 2.0 was the design of SMC. So you had development core and then you had production core. And so the capability in it, and so literally program managers were assigned to go develop through CDR, and then you have a different program manager take over to execute and get through launch and on station and all of that. So the integration was happening for the old organization was to help glue those areas together. And so every mission area, we would have mission integrators that would make sure that the development to the production happened. With the current SSC organization, the PEOs have end-to-end accountability. So with those missionary capabilities, for example, for GPS, those moved under the GPS program manager. So we don't have that role to glue together the upfront and the back end, and that's PEO owned. The capability integration we're trying to do at this point, and again, I would say trying or starting, and it's been going for a while, but it's really understanding these mission threads. And so we've, and again, a lot of this is done at a classified level, so you can't really be specific, but you can think indications and warning to taking an action, and what are all the mission systems that you need to operate, that need to operate together. And that's really what those teams are focused on at this point.
So another question that came from the audience is, how does SSC fund these integration efforts? This sounds fairly extensive. And if you're not sitting in the PEO and the actual program of record, how are these integration activities supported?
Yeah, so that's whoever's watching really understands the government and how they work.
That's our audience. Let's go. Yeah.
So today it is funded through a tax to the PEOs, and it's managed then at the SSC level, essentially. So we end up with a head count. We want to shift that so that we're not taxing programs, so that we have our own, so there's a set of support functions, not just my office, but CIO and some other things that so that SSC has its own PE for those kinds of things, so we don't end up taxing programs.
Okay. And kind of let's see, another go back on kind of the innovation and integrating new capabilities into programs. What do you see as the role of the prime and kind of more of the classic performers in that discussion? Because you mentioned AFRL and Sheba's prototyping group and SpaceWorks, which we work with a lot of them, but what's the role of the prime in that same discussion?
So that's a good question. I mean, I think the primes to some level have been focused on the programs of record. What I would like to see again over time is, as you have these innovation capabilities, come to fruition, that the primes adopt them and that they bring innovation to the table themselves. And so I think it might be a good question for future contracting is, will one of the evaluation criteria be the extent to which primes bring in these small businesses? And so, I mean, there's been some requirement for small businesses. It's really pretty small, but, can you restructure an acquisition strategy to require, when you're doing, a ground system or something, to have, the services are integrated in a certain way that would enable bringing in, small companies. I don't know that we have a great answer for that. I think that will evolve over time. But I think it would be better if it's a big program and a big prime, it would be nice if they were pulling in, the innovation activities.
Kind of a pivot back to people. You're the SSIO in terms of mission integration. So who's responsible for also looking at kind of across the workforce there at SSC and integrating it culturally? And how important is that into your thinking, and what changes need to be made in your workforce and in your priority to kind of create a workforce and a culture that is ready for this new way of doing business that you're describing?
So, yep, another good question. I think culture, is, I don't know, it's set somewhat top down, but then of course you could all argue that it's also set bottoms up. So I think you have to lead by example. So I think it starts with General Gutlein, and I think my office does play a big role. And I'm trying to set a tone that we are not enforcers, we are partners, right? So, and then again, I think you change behavior with your actions. And so things like setting up workshops to get after, specific problems and bringing in, so that we're working across SSC. We're not trying to break down those stovepipes. So I think we all need to be watchdogs of culture. It's not just General Gutlein and the front office and SSIO, it's all of us. I've seen really excellent cooperation with the current set of PEOs. So you have General Purdy, you have General Sheba, you have Colonel De Niro, I'm missing, and Mr. De La Pena. These are people who want to work together. They're all about mission. And so I think we have a good leadership team that can help set the tone. I do think one of the huge barriers at this point in time is still COVID and still, the percentage of the workforce that's working from home. And so that to me it's kind of a sad fact of life. We have to figure out how to the extent that we can get people back, maybe allow some flexibility. So maybe it's not every day in the office, but I think building teaming, the ability to work across PEOs, the ability to solve problems together, I think is really key. So definitely something we want to get after. Definitely recognize it's a long process. But I think demonstrating through action is really important.
Let's see. So here's kind of a what if. So if you were able to set up a cross mission area CCB, who would you see chairing it?
So it's a good question. My organization, again, there's really the three big buckets: the engineering, we call it programming and governance, which includes the POM, but then the governance processes, and then the requirements and capability integration. That engineering side, the plan is to have that engineering side chair it. We have a DICES position, which is an SES equivalent it's been posted, and it's in selection at this point in time. But to me, that senior leader would be the chair of the CCB. And then I would be back up to them, not necessarily prime, but that's where we're trying to center that responsibility.
So kind of a framing question. So the national defense strategy is really kind of pointing to China as the pacing threat, and how do we kind of increase our deterrence posture against China? How do you impart that same kind of priority, sense of timing across this disparate ecosystem, from between your ongoing programs of record as well as through the emerging kind of commercial and international sector?
Right. So I think we actually are in the middle of pivoting. I do think Secretary Kendall has outlined his operational imperatives. Space was number one, was in operational imperative one. It's not that it is number one, but how space enables the operational imperatives is key. So we did a major pivot in the 23 POM to address the Secretary's operational imperatives. So I think, and that's pretty, it was really in the 24 POM. So 23 had already been potted, but as we get ready for 24. So by participating in the analysis and the requirement shifts and the what can help a 2026 fight, it's really through the operational imperatives. And there were some significant pivots to fund certain capabilities at a faster rate, to get capability out there sooner. So again, it's through funding, it's through programs, and it's through pretty deep analysis of requirements related to the operational imperatives.
Okay. So we only have a couple more minutes here. So if you're in the audience and you have a question, get it typed in. So what, again, back on kind of the SWAC effort, where do you see kind of your next iteration with them? We've been talking about kind of the backhaul and the data layer as kind of the next priority. What's in the queue from your mind as the next challenge to follow?
Again, it's really working through each of the mission areas. I actually think the operational imperatives and addressing those is probably almost in front of SWAC as well. So the space data transport force design, that has implications, I think, for the next decade of acquisition. And so I also don't view force designs as static. As things change, they're going to need to be updated. I think we've seen this with missile warning, missile track, where they had the initial force design with proliferated LEO and MEO, and then they've been tuning things, and then that gets into what is SDA going to do, tranche 0, tranche 1, tranche 2, and how does this evolve over time? And I think things shift, and then that implies you need to go back to SWAC to say, hey, this is what we're seeing, and can you validate that this would be a good strategy? So I don't view these things as static. I think we kind of need to update them regularly. In terms of priorities, I mean, again, the priorities I went through with my workshops was really just my organizational priorities. I think we are also paying attention to what SWAC is doing when, and then responding to, to when they're going to have their next force design. So I don't have like a list of, what year and month are each of the mission areas coming out, but it is stuck in my mind that PNT was 2023. So, we'll be ready for that.
Right. Okay, so I'll just ask one last wrap up question here. So our audience out here is mostly industry, but some government, but then it's Title 10, Title 50. It's kind of the people with an interest and a stake in the national security space community writ large. What can we all do to help?
That's a good question. I think by paying attention to, the challenges that are out there and offering solutions, and maybe being a little pushy with saying, hey, I've got some good ideas, because I think we all have limited bandwidth, and so the squeaky wheel gets the grease for sure. But, help bring solutions. Don't just raise issues, but if you have an issue, come with some candidate solutions as well.
Will do. Dr. Leon, it's been an absolute awesome pleasure to host you here today, and congratulations. Welcome back to the Space Force, or welcome to the Space Force, I guess. And thank you very much for taking the time with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.